Welcome to the fourth lesson of the fiction and poetry section. And finally, we have reached the climax. So, the climax. This is everything that we've been building up for. It's the most important, most exciting, most incredible part of your story. Yay! Okay, so everything leading up to this point, the exposition, the complications, they have all been building this suspense, especially if we're looking at Bram Stoker's Dracula. This is where the terror has been coming to. This is where we can finally be absolutely horrified and get all of our questions answered. So, what is the climax of Bram Stoker's Dracula? He infects Mina. This is what we've been waiting for. This is the absolutely horrifying part. So, Dracula attacks Mina, and under the nose of the Crew of Light, as they are so often referred to as, he does this. It's horrible. He forces her to drink his blood, and then he suddenly controls her. Terrifying, disgusting, repulsive. However, absolutely intriguing, and this is what we have been waiting for. This is the climax. So, the climax is what you need to think of as the very pinnacle of that mountain. We've been climbing up that steep slope this entire time, and now as readers, we finally get the exciting part. How do we create a climax in a story? Yeah, that's tricky. That's the part that a lot of people have some problems with. This relies upon your complications. So, just to kind of point that out one more time, I know you probably just watched that video, but my point is that your complications help to create your climax. Your complications are what help to create this entire scenario and what makes it so exciting. So, let's talk about that climax. It's extremely important. It's extremely exciting. It's the pinnacle of everything, right? We want to make it last. Honestly, yeah, we want to make it last. So, when you actually do reach the climax of your story, you don't want to suddenly bring us back down. Let's look at some climaxes of children's stories. Let's take Goldilocks and the Three Bears. I know we've talked about that one a couple times. The climax of the story is when they actually find her in their house, right? Everything leading up to that is when they come into the house, they're looking for her, she has already come into the house and has used all of their stuff. The absolute climax is when they actually find the girl, right? Terrifying. They're bears. Actually, as adults, it's more terrifying. As a child, not so much, depending on the child, I suppose. So, that's the climax, when they actually find her. Let's look at Red Riding Hood. When she actually realizes that the grandmother sitting in the bed is not her grandmother. When the axeman comes in and kills her, kills the wolf, depending on what story it is that you're reading. That's the climax. That is what we've actually been waiting for. So, think of some movies that you've seen. What is the part that you never tell people if you don't want to ruin the movie for them? The climax, right? You don't tell them the climax, you don't tell them the twist, but you might tell them the premise, right? Or the exposition. You tell them a little bit about the characters, you tell them a little bit about what's going on. However, the climax isn't what you want to give away. That's the most important part. That's the most difficult part as well to create. So, as I said before, all of your complications are going to help to create your climax. What you want to really work with is snowballing that effect. I know we talked about that a little bit before when we were talking about complications. So, you want to build up. If you start off with that big, huge thing that happens, that's your huge complication, where do you have to go? After the climax of a story, everything just goes back down. We need to return to normalcy, right? So we don't want to start out like that. We want our complications to help build. We want them to start out small. Remember the analogy about the car. Small things, right? The engine light comes on. Well, then our character isn't able to make it to work, or our character isn't able to make it to the party. The climax is going to be that major turn that causes something to happen, right? Does the climax have to be bad? Not always. No, we can have a really good climax. We can have something that is absolutely fantastic happen for that character. All the complications that happened before could be adding up to create a really good situation. Is that interesting? Not really. It's pretty interesting for a small child sometimes, but usually not even for them. So when you're talking about your climax, when you're talking about your complications, when you're talking about creating this very interesting story, remember, we get bored. Readers get very bored, and human beings get very bored. We do enjoy a good horror story. We do enjoy a good, vampire novel, or somebody being killed, or something bad happening. We're sick creatures that way. Sorry. But what you do need to keep in mind is that if something is so happy-go-lucky, you're going to lose your reader. They're not going to be very interested in it. Now then there's the flip side. If we're talking about the complications leading up to that climax. Let's say, for example, that you wrote a short story and you have 4 or 5 complications. This is not advisable. This is not advisable because your character then seems as though he or she is cursed. Okay, so watch how many complications that you have. Let's say you have your short story and your character's dog has died. Okay, that's very unfortunate. That's very sad. But then your character's having car problems, and that's very bad as well. And then your character loses his or her job. And then your character loses his or her significant other. If this just keeps happening, pretty much you're leading the reader to a climax that isn't desirable. Unless, of course, we do find out that your character is in fact cursed. That's the way that it's going to seem. Okay? So, the climax is where everything is building up to. Okay? Keep the length of your novel or your piece in mind because you don't want far too many complications to lead up to that climax. If you have 2 or 3, you might want to check how long your piece actually is and how many people are actually suffering in your novel. Don't let them be cursed. That's horrible. And also, you kind of lose your reader. While we don't want to read about a happy-go-lucky character, we also don't really want to read about someone who is leading an absolutely terrible life. So be kind to both your reader and your character, to a point. It's okay to kill off a character. That's perfectly fine. If that's the climax, that's great. Good. Good for you. Proud of you. But you don't want too much of that. Some challenges that writers face is, obviously making their stories a little too happy, making their stories a little too simple, and also making their stories a little too gruesome. Think about the different movies that you like to watch as well, or different stories that you like to read. Oftentimes, we're not going to have a climax that revolves around an unfortunate character. Also, we don't have a climax that revolves around a really lucky character, right? Let's revisit our cheerleader for a second. So, she's obviously had a very blessed life. She's had a very good life. She is head cheerleader. She's beautiful. She's popular. However, in one of our scenarios, she accepted a beer. In another scenario, she did not. So, let's look at the climax of that story. Later on, let's say if she did accept the beer, she has that mentor now who is a teacher at her school. What if all of a sudden she starts having a relationship with this mentor, and the climax is they get caught? This is a happy-go-lucky character where nothing good can come from this situation, right? She's underage. She's with a faculty member at her school. That's not going to end well. That's not going to end well at all. That does create a very interesting scenario. However, that's because something unfortunate happened. If, let's say, she does not accept the beer, and in this case she decided to run for class president. Okay, well this could go one of 2 ways. She could win, or she could lose, right? Again, this is the climax of our story. We're going to find out what happens to her in this, right? What if she loses and her life starts going down this horrible path? Then we might have another climax. What if she wins and her life starts going down this great path or a horrible path, depending upon the situation that she finds herself in next? Remember, this is the snowball effect. This is where everything just goes up and up and up and up until we actually hit that pinnacle of a climax. So, be kind to your characters. Don't let them be too cursed, but then also don't make their lives too easy for them. We want them to grow. We want them to be human. We want them to be individuals who are able to make decisions and who are very relatable. We have climaxes in our lives as well. We have things that are very important, and everything snowballs to get to that point. Keep that in mind and let the climax kind of come to you. Don't force it, and don't make something that is not believable.